Thank you for meeting with me today. This is Dr. Cropley. So, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very good, thanks. Yeah. It's an absolute pleasure to come and talk to you about something that I think's really important and obviously a big part of my research and professional practice. So, thanks for inviting me to be part of the interview.
So the topic I'd like to focus on with you today is one that's quite topical with the release of programmes recently, such as Alan Shearer's Dementia, Football and Me. And so one of the things I'd like to look at is the role of playing sports in developing degenerative diseases such as dementia, CTE, things like that of that nature. So first thing I'll ask you is there a possible risk of developing dementia or these kind of diseases in later life for athletes who play contact sports for a significant part of their lives? And if so, how big of a risk is it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I suppose we can look at both of the biggest aspects of the media, which has been Alan Shearer's documentary on dementia in football, and also the film with Will Smith, Concussion, that talks about CTE in American football. And whilst the film, which was obviously based on a true story, seemed to suggest some really significant evidence that led to rule changes in the NFL, which would suggest that contact sports do have a massive impact on degenerative brain and mental functioning. The documentary by Alan Shearer didn't prove any particular evidence to suggest that heading football, for instance, had such effects. So we kind of got a lot of anecdotal reports from, particularly within football, of ex-players suffering from increased risk of degenerative brain diseases, but we probably don't have the empirical and scientific evidence to suggest that there is a cause and effect relationship between the activities involved in football and those outcomes. Rugby's a little bit different in terms of obviously the contact that's involved and the amount of information that we now have on the impact of concussions on player welfare and well-being. So there does seem to be some evidence. It's just that we haven't got that empirical cause and effect relationship as of yet to suggest what the impacts are and potentially what aspects of the sport cause those issues.
So with that being said, can the reverse also be true in that playing contact sports can instead reduce the risk of developing those brain diseases?
Yeah, again, it's there's probably no hard and fast rule here. We know that obviously playing sports has a big impact on physical health, which can also have a big impact on cognitive functioning. So there are obviously a lot of benefits associated with taking part in sport and physical activity. Contact sport is also a very high risk sport, with a significant increase in the amount of injuries, particularly in rugby, over the last couple of seasons. So we know that playing those sorts of sports can be quite contraindicated, can be quite socially deviant, i.e. players know that they're going to get injured, but they go and play anyway. But there are obviously a lot of health benefits associated with staying fit and healthy physically for, like I said, cognitive functioning and social functioning. So I don't know whether there are reverse effects really on brain functioning or stopping things like dementia or depression or anxiety, but there does seem to be some link and some increase in either protection against those factors or increase in risk of those factors. It's just that we haven't got the research to suggest one way or another at the minute.
So one of the major factors believed to be a possible risk factor, as you mentioned, was concussion or return to action too soon after suffering those kind of concussive blows. Do you think more can be done to prevent or mitigate these risks?
Can they be prevented? Without changing the fundamentals of the sport, I don't think they can be prevented. Obviously in American football, rules around tackling, contact, etc. changed as they have done in rugby union and rugby league. But the big issue that we've got is that they are contact sports. The players are getting physically stronger, physically quicker. The forces that are involved in tackling and the contacts are increasing, and that's obviously going to increase the likelihood of concussions from occurring. I think what we have to be better at doing is preparing players for those situations, both physically and mentally, but also making sure that there's appropriate recovery, rehabilitation and then return to the sport. involved in the situations where players do suffer from concussion. And I know there are significant concussion protocols that have now been brought into sports, but they're obviously in direct conflict with what the clubs want. You know, they pay a lot of money for these athletes to be playing out on the pitch, so the sooner they can get them back to playing, the better. It doesn't necessarily mean that's always better for the player in the long run. So we have a bit of a moral dilemma, I suppose, within elite sport that you know, there's a lot of finance involved. Clubs need these big players to be playing, they need to win, etc. But at the same time, we've got a moral and an ethical responsibility to the welfare of those individuals, because they're people first and foremost before they're athletes. So you know, they're not machines, they need to be treated like people.
How can repeated actions such as heading a football maybe, or receiving a knock on the head in a game of rugby lead to these sort of degenerative areas? Or how is the brain affected by the actions like this?
I suppose the best analogy I can give is when people are involved in a car crash, the actual external body might not move very far, but the forces are having an impact on internal organs. So you can still damage your internal organs when you're involved in a car crash, even if you don't go anywhere, because of obviously the momentum of the car. It's pretty much the same in football when you're heading the ball. Or you get a rattling of the brain, if you like, in the skull cavity, and the same in tackling, in rugby, in all contact sports. And obviously that movement, there is obviously cranial fluid in there to try and protect the brain, but it's getting bashed about, for want of a better term, quite a lot during these sorts of contacts. So, like I said, in the Alan Shearer documentary, they didn't identify any particular impact of repeated heading of the ball on cognitive functioning or damage to the brain, but they certainly have in American football, where that CTE is that rattling of the brain that can cause significant issues in the future that might not demonstrate themselves initially, but obviously progress from players experiencing severe headaches and migraines to delusional visions, to loss of sight, to loss of consciousness, etc. So there does seem to be some impact on the damage to the skull caused by the rattling of the brain, but again, you know, the evidence is either out there and hidden by authorities who don't want it to come out, or it's not available.
Do you feel that perhaps one day in future we'll be able to either fully mitigate the risks of developing these kind of diseases from playing contact sports, what we're beginning to understand from increased research?
Research is always going to help. It's going to give us an understanding of the current landscape of the issues. It's going to help us to understand the etiology of the issues, why things happen, what the main consequences are. But in my opinion, unless we start to change the rules of the sport or look to try and protect children who play the sport, unless we try and protect these players in some way by rule changes, etc., it's going to be a natural part of the game. Some people would argue that as long as players are made aware of the potential dangers, then it's up to them to make the decision about whether they participate or not, understanding that there is a risk that they could form these diseases moving forwards. But it's very difficult to give an 18-year-old potentially that decision, who all they want to do is play the sport and potentially earn a lot of money from it, and then ask them to make a decision about what their mental health or their physical health might be like in 20 years' time. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 at the minute, so I think potentially rule changes might be important. I know football have talked about potentially removing heading from the game up to a certain age. Whether that will have a big difference or not, I'm not too sure.
And finally, players often don't know or aren't made aware of the risks associated with playing sports and mental health. Understanding management roles as you do you feel that more management schemes or techniques are needed to help players fully understand the risks involved?
Yeah. Where that information comes from, whether it's the manager or the coach, I'm not too sure. Like I said, there's a real conflict here between a coach is placed under significant demands in terms of trying to get performances results. In order to get performances results, they need their best players performing out on the pitch. So they have their own self-preservation motivations, i.e. get players fit, get them out on the pitch. that doesn't always necessarily mean that it's right for that particular player at that time. So I think there are a lot of organisations involved in sport, like the Players Football Association and the equivalents in other sports, where the organisations are out there to look after the welfare of the players and the development of players and the transition of players out from the sport out to other areas outside of the sport. So I think that information has to come from them. We have to provide more information about the potential risks to allow people to make more informed decisions.
Thank you very much for your time.
No, not a problem. Thank you. Cheers.